the
John,
chamber's
son
ledger.
of Thomas.
The messenger's wrist
Bartholomew,
snapped against the
baker.
post when the notary
Thomas,
pushed
son
the
of
quill into his
Bartholomew.
trembling hand and said, "Write what we tell you." A thin
This
line
ledger
of
is a
blood ran
fabrication.
along the knuckle from the binding. The notary held the ledger open and watched the messenger scrawl the words they shaped. Betrayal appeared in the room as plain as ink. Every man there recognized who had been bought and who had been silenced. The narrator notes this moment without pity. He names the place. A dim side chamber under the papal apartments late at night. He names the men who stand in the doorway. Pope John XII watches from a shadowed chair, his fingers rubbing the heavy signet ring. Captain of the Guard leans on the threshold. The scene shows the central problem. The papal office has begun to function as an instrument for removing threats with falsified paper and violence. The messenger, mute from fear, signs the confession in a cramped hand. He glances once at the Pope. The Pope's lips curl. He says, "Enough, the line is short and final." The notary closes the ledger as if it were a sacrament. That single night will mark a chain of choices made by men who prefer power to law. Outside the chamber, voices gather. Cardinal Rinaldo paces the antechamber with a folded rumour in his fist. He had come to ask questions. He had not expected to find the ledger used as a weapon. His first step in that corridor is a choice to confront. He does not stride in. He stops, listens, then enters. "John," Cardinal Rinaldo says, "we have men missing. We have ledgers. Who answers for this?" The cardinal's voice is low and precise. He lays the word, "who," like a gauntlet across the floor. Pope John XI looks at him without rising. "Rinaldo," he says, "these matters are judged privately. You forget your place." The Pope's tone is measured, like someone quoting a law he drafted himself. The cardinal meets the stare and does not lower his gaze. The argument hardens. Cardinal Rinaldo asks about names. The Pope deflects. Short sentences pass between them. "Where is Maro?" Rinaldo asks. "Maro serves." John says, "Maro has been seen on the river." Rinaldo says, "He carries lists." The cardinal's hands tighten. He shows a small smear of red on his sleeve. The mark is literal, a stain from a page he had handled. Outside, servant Maro moves through a shadowed service corridor with a folded page hidden in his palm. He smells of sweat and wax. He parts two guards and slips a page into accuser Lucia's hands. Lucia takes the paper with a hand that does not shake. She reads the names and the amounts recorded. The ledger ties payments to names and names to the Pope as orders. Lucia steps back into the corridor. She presses the page to her chest and looks up. Her eyes search the stone for a face she can trust. She does not find one and moves onward. Her motion is economy itself. Quick, practical, and controlled. In the vaulted archive beneath the palace, a closed trial is arranged. The Pope summons a notary he trusts and a handful of soldiers who know how to keep their lips sealed. The notary plucks a wax seal and prepares script. They will manufacture the legal cover that will turn murder into judgment. The notary is precise. He inks a stamp. He murmurs phrases that sound like law and sound like absolution. The captain of the guard nods. He runs a hand over the pommel of his sword and leaves it there. The men begin to build the machinery that will take lives under the pretense of justice. Meanwhile, prisoners are moved through narrow, torchlit passages. The guards force them to march with ropes about their wrists and saws against their arms. One of the prisoners stumbles and is struck. The captain does not look. The procession smells of damp cloth and iron. The prisoner's shoes scrape the flagstone in a heavy, human rhythm. Maro watches from a doorway. He had torn pages from the ledger hours earlier and slipped them to Lucia. He now keeps his face turned to the wall. He hears the chains and fights the urge to move toward the prisoners. He wants the ledger revealed. He fears what exposure will bring. Those two motions are the emotional conflict in his chest. The chapter moves toward a confrontation. Lucia and Cardinal Rinaldo arrive at the vaulted archive while the notary is arranging the signatures. Lucia's breath is steady. Rinaldo's steps are heavy. They burst into the room with the stolen ledger spread between them. The scene is sudden. The notary freezes, ink, stained hands still poised above the paper. "This is yours," Lucia says, pointing at a scrawled payment. "This is his mark." Her finger taps a number. She reads aloud the entry, 10 gold for silence, signed, John. The words hang in the air like a command. Cardinal Rinaldo holds the ledger open toward the guards. He repeats the names. He says, "Look, see what he called law." The guards hesitate. The captain's mouth tightens. He looks at John and then at the ledger. Pope John XII stands. He steps forward. His robe is tattered opulence, embroidered where fingers have rested on certain folds for years. He lifts his chin with a brittle dignity. "You will not do this here," John says. His voice has a youth to it, but the tone has grown cold. "You will not humiliate the office." He moves to the notary and takes the ledger back. Trying to close it, Lucia moves faster. She slides a hand between John's and the ledger. "You ordered payments," she says. "You signed these. You did this." Her voice does not quiver. A rapid exchange erupts. The chapter's structure narrows to a short, fierce barrage of lines. "John, you cannot hide behind the tiara." Rinaldo snaps. "Rinaldo, you betray the Holy Seat by speaking such words." John returns. "Betrayal is what you practice." Lucia says, "You will be judged," John says. The back and forth is brief but packed. Each name is used to pin blame and to direct anger. The guards around them shift. Some lower their eyes. One coughs to clear his throat. The notary, faced with the ledger in the open, trembles and drops his quill. That moment is the chapter's turning point. The ledger exposure severs an alliance. A guard who once stood steady loosens his hold on his spear. Another drops to his knees, confused and searching for a command. The captain of the guard steps toward John and snaps a quick order to restrain the intruders, but his voice betrays hesitation. John realizes in discrete, visible motions that his center is unstable. He reaches for the signet ring and rubs it against his thumb. His habitual gesture offers him a second to calculate. In that pause, his decisions pile up like coins on a table. To strike and risk full collapse, to bargain and risk humiliation, to run and risk capture. He chooses to bargain. John moves to the captain. He speaks quickly, in measured undertones. "Captain, take me to my chapel. Escort me. I will answer these charges properly before God and man." The sentence is a bid. Pled for ritual, plea for procedure. The captain's jaw works. He looks at the guards and the ledger. His loyalty divides. Servant Marrow presses forward and grabs the captain's sleeve. "Think, Captain." Marrow whispers, "You saw the names. You saw the coins." Marrow's voice is small. He says John's name like an accusation rather than reverence. The captain blinks. His hand tightens on the hilt of his sword. The captain chooses to retreat to the chapel to buy time. He nods once and moves to begin the escort. The motion is a calculated retreat. John breathes once as if relieved. They move down the corridor toward the private chapel. John walks with a frantic air, shorter steps than usual. The corridor doors close behind them. Lucia and Rinaldo glance at each other and then split. Rinaldo calls for guards loyal to the Curia to block the chapel route. Lucia pushes toward the open courtyard. Outside, the palace courtyard becomes a stage. Word travels like a physical thing. The ledger's names spread across the yard as people change the direction of their steps. Servants who once avoided the Pope now look in his direction with open curiosity. A few mutter, "Ledger, ledger." The phrase is a small, precise contagion. John reaches his private chapel and finds the corridor closed. He pounds on the door. Servant Marrow stands in the threshold and watches him. John pleads with Marrow verbally and with small, feverish gestures. He offers coin, old arguments of favor. He offers protection. He tries to bargain with the only man who might still hold both knowledge and discretion. Marrow has the stolen pages folded inside his linen. He has smelled the ink and the blood that marked several entries. His throat tightens. He had once served John with a young man's unquestioning obedience. Now he feels the lead weight of what he saw. He looks at John and says nothing. Inside the chapel, John tries to kneel and pray. He kneels not for humility but for calculation. He prays in a rote cadence he has used since adolescence. The narrator notes the difference. The motions of liturgy are the same. The intention has changed. John prays to buy time. In the courtyard, Cardinal Rinaldo speaks with men who had guarded documents for years. He shows the ledger. He asks for names and consequences. He organizes a small, improvised tribunal among those present. The crowd grows. Servants, clerks, and a few soldiers gather around the open pages. They point to entries, whisper their recollections, and call out faces. Rinaldo's voice keeps the accretion of detail moving. Lucia watches the chapel doors. She sees John through a narrow window, a gaunt figure in tattered gold. He looks smaller from afar. She feels a flicker of something that is not pity. She breathes out and tightens her grip on the ledger page in her pocket. Back in the chapel, John stands and reads the room. He sees no ally there. He turns to the door and finds the captain's men grouped outside, not rushing in. John's face hardens. He moves toward a small cabinet, pulls free a tarnished papal tiara hidden beneath a cloth, and lifts it as if to reclaim authority. The crowd moves in the archive. The ledger lies plain on a wooden table. Hands point. Voices overlap. A notary there reads sections aloud, translating numbers into meaning. A cleric, who once received payments, swears aloud that certain sums were delivered to silence witnesses. The confession that had been forced earlier now rings back upon the very men who forced it. An argument breaks into a heated exchange between two guards. Short lines pass quickly. "This is forgery," one guard says. "We saw him sign." Another replies, "He ordered it." Rinaldo says, "You cannot accuse the Pope in public." Someone answers. The voices push and pull. The notary who had prepared false documents steps toward the ledger and raises his hands. He says, "Stop. If this continues without order, we will descend into chaos." He tries to restore procedure. But procedure no longer holds the same power it once did. The ledger functions as evidence and as a weapon. Men who had taken orders now read them and recognize the human cost. Scheduled executions, payments to silence families, bribes to commanders. The names do not float as abstractions. They connect to the missing and the wounded. At the height of the confrontation, the captain of the guard changes course. He looks to the Pope's chamber and then to the ledger. His eyes harden. He steps forward and says, "Men, lower your weapons. We must not spill blood here." His line is an attempt to reset the scene. Some comply. Others do not. Suddenly, a minor, sharp sound. The captain's sword clangs on a table as a nervous soldier knocks it. The noise snaps every head around. In that fraction of a second, Lucia drives the wooden table forward and slams the ledger in front of John when he comes thundering back into the archive. The action is small and violent. John sees his own hand in the page. He recognizes handwriting, amounts, and initials. The recognition is a wound. He moves like a man whose private ledger has been turned into a public indictment. He lunges for the pages. Hands reach to stop him. A guard shoves him back. The captain, who had promised escort, finds his authority undercut. He looks to John and to the crowd and realizes that his role has shifted from protector to arbiter, that reclassification of duty is a pivot in his decision-making. John makes a quick, frantic bargain. He whispers to the captain, then to Maro. He offers place and pardon. His voice scrambles. He promises favor to those who will swear the ledger is falsified. The offers are concrete. Titles, coin, relief from duty. Maro hears the offers and touches the pages he stole. His hands tremble. He feels the ledger in his palm like a living thing that could burn him. He moves between John and the crowd and says to Rinaldo, "I took these pages because I could not bear them in the dark. Let them be seen." His statement is an action that exposes motive and forces choices. Rinaldo hears the confession and pushes forward. He says, "Maro, speak plainly. Who paid? Who gave orders?" The exchange builds momentum. The crowd leans like a single organism toward the sound of names. John's face falls when the first name is spoken that binds him. He reaches out and grasps the ledger again. This time, his fingers leave smudges on the ink. The captain moves to restrain him, but an officer from the curia steps in and blocks the captain's hand. The officer says, by order of the chapter, "We must detain those implicated." His tone borrows authority from an institution that is already compromised. The situation fractures into smaller fights. Some men shout for the law to take its course. Others hiss that the law itself is corrupted. Short, rapid lines of dialogue fly between them. "Arrest him." One man cries, "No, arrest the notary." Another replies, "Stop, stop," the captain says. In the chaos, John bolts for a side doorway. He runs with uneven steps, his robe catching on a nail. He hits the courtyard, hands outstretched to find the chapel route. The courtyard doors are barred. Former allies close ranks and refuse him passage. He slams his shoulder against wood and finds only locked iron. A rapid negotiation follows in the open air. John tries to bargain with those gathered. He promises mercy and retribution in the same breath. He offers titles and pardons in exchange for silence. Men who had once accepted gifts from him now weigh the ledger against their name. Cardinal Rinaldo places the papal seal and the ledger together on a wooden table in the courtyard. He taps the page and says, "Your office cannot hide these payments." Not here. The cardinal's action is small and precise. It directs the crowd's attention to evidence rather than rhetoric. John's attempt to escape collapses into a bargaining failure. He appeals to the captain and to Maro. He pleads with Lucia by name. He reaches for the tiara once more as if its weight might restore order. A servant lifts the tiara from the chapel door and tosses it onto the ledger. The tiara lands askew, its jewels catching the candlelight, then dulling under dust. The crowd's mood shifts into something colder. Decisive anger. Names are read aloud from the ledger and matched to faces in the crowd. Men who had received small payments find their own reputations at stake. The ledger becomes not only proof of crime, but of complicity. Several people cross themselves. Others stare without moving. At this point, the narrator steps closer to the scene, recording the visible outcomes rather than naming the moral verdict. He notes the broken alliances, the exchange bargains, the sudden silence when the tiara hits the lacquered wood. He records concrete motions. The captain lowering a spear, Maro folding his hands, Lucia stepping back to let the crowd decide. Then the arrests begin. Not the formal, sanctified arrests John begged for, but raw detentions by men who had read their own names in the ledger and decided to act. They seize a notary, then a clerk. They drag them toward the palace dungeons. The crowd shouts names and throws accusations like stones. John stands at the fringe. For the first time in this chapter, he does not move to command, but to bargain with survival. He turns to one figure, a trusted guard who had been his lieutenant for years, and says, "Take me. Bring me before the chapter. Let the law decide." The guard hesitates, then nods. He does not move with fervor. He moves under duress. The chapter closes with a concrete, visible beat. The accused are dragged toward the courtyard gate. The shattered papal tiara is left upon the open ledger. Wine, wax, and ink stain the wood. Cardinal Rinaldo stands and calls for the names to be read into a new register. Lucia folds the stolen pages and hands them to a clerk who will copy them. Maro steps back and watches the procession as people are taken away. The narrator records what he sees. The ledger exposed, the tiara displaced, the shifting loyalties. He notes that the public unmasking here is only a first thread. The ledger's exposure has started a cascade that will force more names into light and more rooms into confession. The final image is not a moral pronouncement. It is an action. Maro laying the remaining torn pages on the table while a guard closes the first set of shackles. The sound of the iron clinking is the chapter's last sentence. Emotionally, the chapter moves through betrayal to fear to resolve. Betrayal motivates the characters. Lucia betrays silence, Rinaldo betrays the Pope's assumed immunity, Maro betrays his service by stealing pages. Fear shifts into anger when the ledger is revealed. That anger becomes a decision to act. The chapter contains two clear shifts of feeling, doubt into action and bargaining into public outcry. Each shift is shown through movement, speech, and small physical details, clenched hands, lowered eyes, forced bargains, rather than abstract meditation. The scenes end with supplyable consequences. Names travel beyond the courtyard. The ledger will be copied and distributed. Men taken toward the dungeons whisper the names of those who ordered their fate. The narrator closes this episode not with an end, but with a fact. The papal chamber that had once administered secrets now sits open. The ledger lies exposed beneath a broken crown. The next chapter will track where those names lead and who answers for the payments recorded in ink and blood. The ledger's echo. A scribe's hand trembled while a notary pressed the quill hard enough to sting the skin. "Write what we tell you," Notary Lucan snapped. The bound man on the floor, Matteo, dripped a thin line of blood from his temple and watched the pen move. Suspicion hardened in Anselm's chest the moment the ledger opened. He suspected the book held more than names. The immediate problem was simple and lethal. The ledger listed men and a shortened punishment beside them, a tool to silence and to sell. The chamber smelled of tallow and iron. The narrator recorded the facts with the same measured cadence he would use for a surgical inventory. The cold opening shows the ledger's purpose. Anselm's fingers skidded on the page as Lucan dictated. Pastor, cut ties, Paulo, silence and exile. Matteo, private correction. Lucan's voice was flat. Write Matteo down. Lucan again. Anselm wrote. The pen scraped. A guard tightened the rope around Matteo's wrists, and the rope bit into his skin. Matteo wheezed. The ledger's list mapped the immediate danger. Names, shortened methods, and a column of payments. That column was what shifted suspicion into dread for anyone who read it. Anselm had arrived in the papal service 2 seasons earlier. He had copied missiles, not men. He knew the ledger's neat script belonged to someone who planned detail and consequence. He had seen a messenger's wrist snapped against a post 2 nights before when a notary had forced a different hand to write. That fractured wrist still stained his memory with red. The narrator would later cite that broken messenger as a proof of method. The Pope used violence to make records appear legitimate. For now Anselm acted under command and terror. Cardinal Pietro leaned forward. He spoke low but with sharpness. "Lucan, are these punishments decided by law?" Lucan's jaw tightened. "By need." Lucan answered, "By the will in the ledger." Pietro reached for the bound page. Someone in the chamber muttered, "Do not touch my ledger." Pope John XII from the shadow at the head of the table. His voice held a youthfully insolent rasp and the habitual curl of his lip. He tapped a signet ring with 2 fingers and watched the room. Anselm watched the ring too. The ring was a threat in slow motion. That first confrontation defined the chapter's central conflict. The ledger as tribunal and the ledger as threat. Anselm's choices from that moment were governed by suspicion, and then as events progressed, fear. He hesitated when Lucan for the folded column of methods. He feared what exposure would bring to Matteo. He feared the Pope's impatience. He feared the ledger itself. Those fears tightened his grip on the pen, and then loosened it when he saw a smudge that did not belong. In the next hour the room shifted from record to tribunal. Lucan slid a folded column toward the candle and showed shortened marks beside each name. A cross with a slash meant private correction. A dot with a dash meant exile. A small circle meant payment and silence. Lucan demonstrated on a scrap of parchment so everyone understood the code. "This is not clerical work, Cardinal Pietro. This is a court of shadows." The Pope smiled without humor. "The court that keeps Rome framed," he said. The smile was a dismissal. That exchange pushed Anselm from suspicion into clarity. The ledger organized punishment the way an index organizes a library, but its reasons were not pious. Pietro objected when Lucan proposed announcing the list at morning vespers. "Public naming will shame the church, Pietro. It will destabilize trust." The Pope tapped the ledger with his dagger, an idle gesture that suggested readiness to convert paper into action, then private correction. The Pope decided, "We will not parade them. We will refine them in private and return stability. Lucan rose and signed a servant to fetch Matteo. The scene turned toward a private room where pain would be delivered and hidden. Servant Marta came with a rope and bandages. Her hands did not shake when she bound Matteo, but her mouth did. Marta had served in the corridors long enough to know which orders broke men. She walked past Anselm and whispered, "Hide the ledger fragment if you can," Anselm's throat closed. He had noticed a folded slip tucked between the pages when Lucan unfolded the column. The slip jittered with coded initials and a column of payments. He had not yet read the names. He slid the slip into his sleeve when Marta's back turned. The first emotion shift arrived in a single private act, from suspicion to covert protectiveness. Anselm's fingers burned with the ledger's ink. In the side room, the correction began as an official procedure. Cardinal Pietro stood by the threshold, arguing with the Pope about propriety. Matteo's breathing was shallow. He had been captured 3 days earlier, his crime recorded as dissent in a different hand. A guard held Matteo's head upright while a thin leather strap snapped across the condemned man's knuckles. "Matteo," the Pope said. "Close enough for him to hear. Your errors will teach others caution." Matteo's mouth opened and nothing emerged. His body reacted with a jerk and a low groan. Back at the table, Anselm unfolded the slip in the dim light. The edges were damp with candle wax. The names were shortened at first, but beneath the codes he found clear surnames and a column of amounts. Money had bought silence. The ledger functioned as both legal instrument and ledger of corruption. Anselm felt a new emotional shift. Fear turned toward a cold resolve to do something with the fragment. He did not yet know what. He only knew that he could not return the slip to Lucan's hand without causing Matteo to die. Anselm moved like a man rehearsing a prayer. He closed the slip and folded it into the seam of his sleeve. In the main chamber, Cardinal Pietro, who had returned from the private room, reached for the sealed ledger. "Lucan, Pietro, I will examine this. The Church must answer to truth." Lucan blocked his hand with a flat palm. "No, Lucan, you will sully yourself if you pry where you are not allowed." Pietro's face went hard. "John Pietro," to the Pope, speaking the name with the weight of office, "you cannot keep these names in secret and call it governance." The Pope's reply arrived as action. He stood and struck Lucan across the face. The strike was swift and precise. Lucan's cheeks split and blood dotted the ledger's margin. Guards moved like a single thought. They seized Pietro's wrist and pushed him back. The chamber erupted. The climax, planned in the outline, arrived with physical violence that unmasked the ledger's role and made internal conflict external. The narrator recorded each movement: the Pope's hand, Lucan's staggered step, Pietro's shocked expression, and Anselm's slip hidden against his ribs. Voices rose in the sudden chaos. "Pietro, Pietro," a courtier hissed. "Do not contest him." Pietro spat blood and said, "You hit my notary. You reveal the ledger's tyranny." The Pope's chest heaved, but his face set into careless charm. "You step forward and you are named," he said. "You speak out and you are punished." Guards dragged Pietro toward the corridor. Anselm used the confusion to slip from the table. He bumped into servant Marta in the dark passage and did not stop. In the corridor, Anselm forced a whisper. "Marta, take this." He pressed the folded slip into her hand. Marta's fingers closed and she looked up at him. "We keep it hidden?" she asked. Her voice was low. "We keep it hidden," Anselm answered. They sealed the pact in 2 sentences. This moment reset the power balance. Clerks and servants moved from passive to custodial roles. The ledger had already dictated punishment. Now someone else held a fragment that could change the ledger's authority. The stolen fragment altered trajectories. Anselm and Marta did not speak about escape. They spoke about placement and access. "Hide it where the priest will not touch." Marta, "Hide it in the altar box, under wax." Anselm nodded and felt the resolve in his limbs. The emotional shift now carried purpose. From fear into determined secrecy. They chose to become keepers of evidence rather than mere witnesses. Word traveled quickly through the corridors. Courtiers whispered about a struck notary and a missing page. The Pope retreated to his private chapel with a bleeding hand and a cracked tiara. He sat with the ring biting his finger, and the ledger closed before him. He examined the gouge on Lucan's cheek from the light that slipped under the chapel curtain. He did not cry. He replaced the tiara with a careful hand and listened to the hallway's soft steps. The narrator recorded the detail. The tinny metallic smell of blood under sweet incense. Outside the private chapel, the court divided into camps. Some courtiers bent toward the Pope with practiced concern. Others clustered around Pietro's defenders. The ledger's missing fragment had become a rumor engine. Men calculated risk. The Pope's grin grew narrow when he saw the crowd split. He spoke to Lucan in the chapel. Find the piece. Find any loose hand. Bring silence back. Lucan had blood on his mouth and anger in his voice. He left with 3 guards. The Pope watched their departure the way a man watches a chessboard move across kindly wood. Anselm and Marta moved at dawn. They placed the fragment beneath a cracked altar candle and rubbed wax over the seam. Marta pressed the wax with her thumb until it cooled. Anselm tied a thread around the box so the seal would appear untouched. Then they returned to the scriptorium as though nothing unusual had happened. The narrator noted the procedure precisely. The placement, the thread, the thumb print in wax. These details mattered because the ledger's power relied on appearances of control. The chapter supplies a mid-chapter cliffhanger when a junior guard who inspected the chapel hesitated over the altar box. He lifted the candle briefly. Marta's mouth clenched and Anselm's pulse tapped the base of his skull. The guard lowered the candle and walked away. They had survived a search. The cliffhanger shifted the emotional state again. From resolve to urgent relief, then to renewed dread, when they learned Pietro had been removed from the chamber to a remote wing for questioning. Another revelation arrived when Anselm later opened his palm and saw ink smudges where the ledger had touched his skin. He remembered the messenger's wrist from the previous night, the one snapped by the notary when that man had refused to copy fabricated testimony. That memory confirmed the ledger's history of enforced compliance. It also suggested a deeper twist. The ledger did not only record orders. It documented extortion payments from those who feared its marks. The ledger's column of payments connected ministers, merchants, and foreign envoys to a system of coerced silence. Dialogue resumed at the chapel threshold. Pietro confronted the Pope again, escorted but defiant. John, Pietro, you drench the church in fear. John answered with casual insolence. Pietro, do not pretend you act for purity. You want control you cannot hold. Guards pushed Pietro back. His voice rose. You call it control. You call it governance. But men bleed for your ledger. The Pope's reply was a tilt of the chin. The argument contained quick, active lines. 3 exchanges that flashed like steel. The confrontation ended with Pietro's removal and Lucan's silent vow to retrieve the missing fragment. The chapter's twist widened the ledger's implication. Officials outside the papal household had paid the Pope to keep their secrets, and those names were in the ledger. That knowledge made the ledger no longer a private instrument, but a potential engine of political collapse. Anselm and Marta realized that revealing the slip could free some and ruin others. Marta pressed the wax seal again because she understood stakes in practical terms. A broken seal would attract a search. They chose to keep the fragment concealed, but their concealment now counted as an act of rebellion. By mid-dawn, the market outside the Vatican gates pulsed with mundane life. Vendors shouted, horses stamped, and children chased a hoop. The court's rot did not yet touch the street, yet men in the square told one another in hushed tones about a ledger and a struck notary. The narrator noted the social spread as evidence of contagion. Secrets leak and become reputation. That detail explained the broader danger to the Pope. His ledger, once private, was now a rumor that could be weaponized by enemies. As the chapter built, choices hardened. Anselm wanted to burn the slip. Martyr opposed instantaneous destruction. If we burn it, Martyr, they will search for the smell. They will know we had it, Anselm. Then we must move it where no one looks. The ledger's own binding. Martyr's eyes widened to hide the ledger inside the ledger. She touched the thought as if feeling a coin in her palm. They planned a substitution, a fabrication of an old page that would answer inspection while the real fragment lay hidden elsewhere. That plan raised stakes and required deception rather than passive concealment. Outside, in a private corridor, the Pope inspected Lucan's wound with the hand that bore a ring. Find the fragment, he ordered. Find the hand that took it. His command was a promise of consequence. Lucan bowed and left. The Pope clenched his jaw and pulled his robe tighter. He smelled of incense and metal. The narrator recorded the sensory detail without flourish and logged John's motive, maintain power and pleasure at any cost, again as evidence rather than opinion. The final sequence resolved the immediate conflict while keeping the chapter's larger story in motion. Anselm and Martyr executed their substitution. They created a forged page that listed trivial names and harmless notations and placed it into the ledger. They doctored the binding so that an inspection would yield nothing of consequence. Then they moved the real slip to a hollowed-out book in a remote corner of the archive. Their hands trembled while they worked, but their faces stayed still. They spoke only in short orders now. Martyr, now we wait. Anselm tied the ledger's string and breathed as if he could dislodge a weight from his ribs. The aftermath returned the court to a tense quiet. The Pope inspected the ledger and thumbed a harmless page. He did not find the fragment. He folded the ledger closed and placed the book beside his flagged rosary. He did not know which servant held the truth. The narrator closed the chapter's event log with a concrete scene. The Pope retreated into the private chapel, his hands still slightly stained with Lucan's blood, and ordered a sealed summons for his allies. The ledger's echo would move outward. The final paragraph ties the chapter's mini-conflict to a precise situational beat. Courtiers left in 2 lines. Some to the chapel, some to Pietro's wing. Anselm and Martyr returned to their stations. Anselm felt the ledger's weight under his sleeve. He heard a knock at the scriptorium door. He moved to open it. The knock was single and deliberate. A voice asked, Anselm, the chapter ends on that concrete intrusion rather than reflection. The narrator records the knock and Anselm's hand reaching for the latch, leaving the reader with the immediate question. Who stands at the door? The tiara breaks. Betrayal tightened Anselm's jaw as the messenger's wrist snapped against the post and blood dotted the sleeve of his tunic. The messenger spat a sound and tried to steady his hand. Notary Lucan pushed the ledger forward without looking up. Open it, Lucan. The demand hung in the basilica courtyard like a formal accusation. Within those first moments, the central problem was visible. Names written in ink would decide who kept power and who would answer for murder. Anselm moved first. He had come with a group of notables to force an accounting. He had come because the ledger from the chamber had been whispered about in taverns and corridor steps for weeks. He stepped closer, the dirt of the courtyard compacting under his soles, and watched the messenger lift the cover. The crowd leaned forward. The narrator, steady and unsparing, recorded each movement. The ledger creaked, the quill's nib caught, a smudge of dried ink gleamed. Suspicion drove Anselm's choices. Suspicion had made him bring his sword and refuse the captain's offered seat. The opening minutes contained 3 raw items from past rooms. The messenger's wrist snapped against the post, the notary's temper that had pressed quills into unwilling hands, and the thin line of blood Matteo had left on the floor when the ledger was first bound. Anselm remembered Matteo's hand trembling. He remembered Lucan's voice, precise and raw. These memories were concrete facts. They sharpened the assembly into motion. Anselm's suspicion shifted into anger when Lucan lifted the first leaf and began to read names. Notary Lucan read in a clipped cadence Matteo Bentivoglio, Confession of burial on the Via Salaria, the crowd murmured. Matteo on the ragged pallet did not look away. A thin rivulet of blood on his temple had dried into brown. Anselm heard a woman in the crowd say, "He admits it." Another man said, "It names the cardinal." The ledger named favors, bribes, and the methodical removal of opponents. Each entry was a practical instruction: who had paid whom, which guards had been paid to look away, the precise night and gate where a body was disposed. These were actions, not metaphors. They forced immediate choices. Pope John XII stepped down from the basilica steps into the courtyard wearing tattered opulence. His robes hung heavy with embroidery that had lost much of its thread and luster. He moved with a practiced charm meant to smooth the edges of confrontation. "You will not shame this sea in the open," he said, and his voice tried for joke but hit a hardness beneath. He rubbed his signet ring between two fingers, that habitual motion Anselm had watched before. The ring caught the weak dawn and showed a tarnished family crest. Anselm's doubt hardened into a different feeling: outrage. He felt it in the clench of his fists and in the way his jaw refused to ease. Anselm, Notary Lucan aloud, looking at him directly, read the second list. Read the names of those who gave orders. Anselm bent, voice low and factual. "Lucan, I will read it." He opened the ledger and began a slow, exacting recitation. The crowd tightened. He read Matteo's entry out loud. "The night on the Via Salaria, a bribe given to Captain Florio, a silence purchased for a body dragged from a cart and left under a dark bridge." Voices rose. Florio. Someone demanded Cardinal Rinaldo. Another asked. The captain of the guard, Captain Florio, stepped forward, hands empty. "I served the sea," he said. His voice had an edge that did not quite mask panic. Anselm watched him. The captain's pause shifted how the guards stood. Alliances bent like undercurrents. Anselm's anger moved into calculation. He needed witnesses, and he needed to prevent the Pope from buying off whatever loyalty remained. Pope John XII offered bribes in words and small gestures. "You misread, Anselm," he said. "That ledger is forged. I have given this city peace." He thrust a small bag of coin forward and tried to produce a laugh that would move the crowd toward pity. He lifted his hand in an attempt to show weakness turned into magnanimity. Anselm's hands tightened on the ledger. He glanced at Notary Lucan. Anselm verified the ink. Lucan's face did not change. He tapped a thumb along a page edge, then pointed. The ledger revealed a name that flexed the room. A respected cardinal listed as an accomplice. Gasps rippled. Captain Florio's eyes flicked to the corner where a cardinal's retinue stood. The retinue did not move. The captain's grip on his sword loosened. Anselm felt a new emotion swell. Betrayal now folded into confusion. This was an emotion shift: suspicion, anger, confusion. He spoke only when forced by Lucan's insistence. "Cardinal Rinaldo is named in the ledger, who stands for truth." His voice stayed low, controlled. "Who will read the next line?" A page turned. The ledger spelled out the Cardinal's involvement with dates and sums that detail changed loyalties. The captain's hesitation was visible. His boots scuffed the stone. His eyes darted between the Pope and the Cardinal. The mob leader took it as the moment to press. "Seize the ring!" he barked. Hands moved. Servants of the sea stepped back and murmured. The Pope's charm faltered. He showed a flash of insolence, then reached for a hidden dagger at his belt. The movement was fast and aimed. It was not a metaphor. When the Pope drew the dagger, the courtyard erupted. Matteo lunged. Captain Florio shoved forward. For a breath the scene was a close, violent scramble. Matteo grabbed the Pope's wrist. The captain tackled a servant trying to reach the dagger. Anselm shoved a table to block a path. Dialogue cut between them, short lines that pushed the action. "Drop it." Anselm Maro stepped back. Captain Florio growled, "On the ground." Pope John XII laughed once, a mirthless sound, and called, "You will not strip me here." The exchange contained the required rapid back and forth. 3 to 6 lines collided and then resolved into motion. The Pope's dagger bit air. A guard's leather cuff tore. A servant screamed. The Pope stumbled back toward his throne alcove. The chamber's doorway slammed open as more townsmen surged from the courtyard. The mob leader shoved forward and a hand caught the Pope's robe. The tiara wobbled. Someone in the mob hit the stand, and the tiara fell, striking stone. A crack ran along metal and jewel. It split with a clean, cruel sound. That sound became the cliffhanger. For a beat no one spoke. Then a child's cry cut the pause. The senior cleric nearest the altar moved like a man who had something to lose, and yet something to protect. He tucked a portion of the ledger into his sleeve and sealed it with wax. "Lucan!" Anselm shouted, "Seal and name what you will keep. We must record who will answer." Lucan drew a blade, edge of his own, and forced the messenger's hand open to show all the pages. The crowd calmed into a slow, dangerous hush. The climax built in the chamber. The Pope's charm collapsed entirely into raw, exposed cruelty. He swung at Matteo and missed. Matteo responded with a blow that sent the Pope down from the throne at last. The mob surged and dragged him by robe and hair across the stone floor. The camera of facts, the narrator's strict attention, followed each bruise and scraped flesh. The tiara lay in shards at the Pope's feet. Blood and spilled wax pooled around it. This was the chapter's peak. A public overthrow, violent and irreversible. In the aftermath, names were read again on the basilica steps. Notary Lucan held the ledger aloft like a litigant's evidence and called out names with clinical precision. Who would be imprisoned? Who would be exiled? Who would be spared through testimony? The captain of the guard ordered 2 men taken for questioning. "Arrest Reinaldo S. Steward," he said. "Bring the cardinal in for counsel." Anselm stepped forward and told the crowd exactly what would happen. A sealed deposition, a public hearing, and a list of those removed from command. He made choices in a clear chain, not from rhetoric but from actions. Who to detain, which doors to lock, and which guards to reassign. The narrator noted the attempt at what the assembled called justice. It was immediate and procedural. Notary Lucan took the ledger and tore out one leaf, folded it, and placed it in a leather case. "This will be kept sealed until the council meets," he said. The crowd watched as Lucan stamped wax and placed it where it could not be read by a curious hand. Anselm felt an ache in his chest, sharp, physical, when he saw the Pope's signet ring slide from a knocked-off finger and roll into the dust. That signet, once a tool of purchase, lay dulled and meaningless now. The narrative offered a twist. A page in the ledger, read later that same morning by Lucan, revealed not only the cardinal's complicity, but also a previous ledger entry that showed how a trusted commander had covered an execution on a night when the captain claimed to be at the barracks. The revelation forced Captain Florio to step back and confess he had passed orders under pressure. This twist changed how Anselm and the crowd understood earlier events. It showed that some agents, Captain Florio included, had been maneuvered into obedience through fear and debt, not mere greed. The Assembly's decisions shifted again. Some men would face trial, others would be offered the chance to testify in public and exchange testimony for leniency. Dialogue moved processes forward. "Florio, Anselm, did you sign orders to bury the man on Via Salaria?" "I followed orders," Florio answered. "Who gave them?" "I was told by the papal steward." Florio replied. "Name him." "I cannot alone." Florio's voice broke into a cough. The crossfire of names and demands forced the captain to produce witnesses. The crowd supplied 2. A stable boy and a fainting maid who had seen a carriage arrive that night. Their testimonies were short and precise. The stable boy said, "I saw the cart at midnight." The maid said, "I saw the steward moving a sack." Their statements were concrete and moved the investigation. The morning hardened into a list of consequences. Not everyone in the basilica sought blood. Some clerics argued for formal trial and canonical process. Others wanted immediate punishment. Anselm pressed for order. "We remove him today from the throne, Anselm. We put the ledger where men can read it. We appoint a council to decide punishment." He spoke without flourish. He assigned Mauro to gather witness lists and told Captain Florio to secure the cardinal. Anselm's decisions were actions that redistributed power. They also reflected his need for stability rather than revenge. Servant Marrow acted as ordered. He moved among the crowd collecting names and pointing to those who had been implicated. He found Matteo and helped him to a place where a cleric could clean his temple wound. Matteo whispered a confession to Lucan, another concrete line. The name of a gatekeeper who had been paid for silence. Lucan took the name and recorded it. These practical steps fulfilled an emotional requirement. For Anselm, the anger had shifted again into wary resolve. That was the second major emotion shift. Anger, calculation, wary resolve. By noon the tiara lay broken on a cracked altar. Lucan sealed part of the ledger into the archives and left one section exposed on the basilica steps for public reading. The crowd leaned in to read the list of names they now had permission to speak aloud. The narrator observed each detail without moralizing. Wax the ledger's weight, the way the Pope's robe trailed grime. The public naming functioned as both punishment and deterrent. Men who had closed hands against truth found their names in black ink and in people's mouths. The immediate punishments were concrete. Captain Florio relinquished his command pending a formal hearing. Cardinal Rinaldo was taken into custody and escorted under guard. His face was pale and blank, eyes avoiding contact with those he had once patronized. The mob leader who had started the surge was given authority to guard the basilica perimeter under Anselm's oversight. Lucan placed a sealed portion of the ledger into the basilica's chest and handed the other pages to the magistrate for trial. A surprising moment changed perspective. Notary Lucan produced a concealed page that showed the ledger had been altered at least once. He traced a fingerprint blurred in ink and explained in clipped words that the signature at the bottom of one page did not match the hand of earlier entries. Someone forged this line, Lucan. Someone tried to reroute blame. The discovery did not exonerate the Pope entirely, but it forced the assembly to reconsider the chain of culpability. This twist made the crowd murmur and broke some of the certainty they had felt an hour earlier. The narrator recorded the final procedural actions. Anselm convened a small council of notables and clerics. The captain ordered guards at gates. Lucan sealed testimony. The assembly made 3 decisions that morning. Detain the accused pending trial, protect Matteo and other witnesses, and place a magistrate to oversee the formal inquiry. The choices were not theatrical. They were administrative and brutal in their finality. People would lose rank, property, and names. Some would face long confinement. The ledger would be both evidence and indictment. At midday, an exhausted hush settled into parts of the basilica. The Pope lay collapsed, bruised on the floor near his shattered tiara. Anselm stood over him and did not gloat. He picked up the signet ring and dropped it into a leather pouch that Lucan had produced. The pouch would be kept with the sealed pages. Anselm plainly, "We will not hang him here." He gestured to the captain. "Take him to the tower. Guard him. He will answer to the council." That decision closed the public overthrow without a lynching. It turned raw mob justice into recorded process. The chapter closed on concrete actions that would ensure memory. Notary Lucan placed the ledger's sealed portion into the archive with wax and a small written inventory pinned to the chest. He read aloud the inventory and the exact times of the sealing. "This ledger will not leave these walls without a magistrate's warrant," he said. The narrator noted the sound of the wax seal and the mechanical certainty of the inventory. The final lines tied directly to physical events. The tiara lay split on stone, the pouch contained a ring, the ledger was sealed, and men were escorted to cages for questioning. The last paragraph ends with a concrete beat. A messenger arrived at the basilica gate, breathless, and handed Anselm a folded note with a new signature, one that suggested a regional lord had already chosen a side. Anselm slit the seal, read the single line aloud to Lucan and the captain. "We claim the right to verify the ledger." He folded the paper and put it into his breast. The decision to accept that verification or refuse it would set the next day's motions, and for now the tiara lay broken and the ledger recorded the cost. Emotion root. Betrayal. Emotion shifts recorded. Suspicion, anger, confusion. Anger, calculation, wary, resolve. The chapter resolves the public overthrow, names those complicit, secures witness testimony, and preserves a sealed record against later erasure. The events conclude on a practical, situational beat that forces immediate choices and sets the administrative aftermath in motion.